Hello. Thanks for tuning into this video recording. My name is Tom Hoeksema, and I'm a board member of All One Body. Along with the Hesed Project, CRC, we've been listening to questions coming out of our churches. And we want to offer this video in response. People are asking, what are the implications of Synod 2022's decisions? What does this mean for our congregation and our office bearers? What does it mean for us as members of the church? So we've brought together three pastors who are long experienced in the denomination. And in a few minutes, they'll introduce themselves. But first, I'd like to offer a prayer. Please join me. Creator God, you made all things, and you are making all things new. As we discern ways forward for this part of your church, please give us all that we need: clear thinking, humility, patience, forbearance, so that we can make our love for you and for each other obvious and irresistible. Amen. I'm going to turn it over to our participants.
Wonderful. Thanks, Tom. My name is Dwayne Kelderman. I am a pastor of the Christian Reformed Church. I am a member of Neyland Avenue Christian Reformed Church, past pastor there, a past professor at Calvin Theological Seminary. I'm happy to ask some questions today to two other pastor colleagues of mine, and I'll ask Thea and Dave to each introduce themselves briefly, and then we'll get started. Thea?
Okay. Yeah. Thea Link. I'm recently retired after 15 years at Eastern Avenue Christian Reformed Church in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and still a member there, and have served as a synodical deputy for several different terms in Classis Grand Rapids East. And in fact, I'm currently right now still a synodical deputy. So that's some of the background I bring.
Yeah, hi, my name is Dave Vroogy. I'm a Christian Reformed minister in Halifax, Nova Scotia in Eastern Canada. Been pastoring with All Nations CRC here for just over 20 years. And I'm also currently a synodical deputy and a regional pastor, and I've been a church visitor and church counselor. So yeah, I also bring those classical roles and experience to this a little bit, and a synodical delegate once.
Great. I'm going to start out by asking, do members who disagree with Synod's decision regarding unchastity and confessional status have to resign from ordained offices, or are there other options?
Sure, I'll start with that one. I think fundamentally, no, people don't have to resign. Office bearers don't have to resign. There's such a thing as a gravamen. We'll talk about that later, or gravamen. We'll also have to agree on how to pronounce it. And we'll talk a bit more about that. I also want to add that it's been the case in the Christian Reformed denomination that people have served in offices and just haven't 100% agreed with everything. I'm not advocating for that. I know we have a covenant of office bearers and we make commitments and we're in a covenantal community. But this happens. And it happens not just on the progressive side of the Christian Reformed denomination. So this does happen. We have conversations, we talk with each other, and everyone who's been served by these office bearers has been richly blessed.
What is a gravamen? How does the gravamen process work? Can only those in church office write a gravamen? Let's talk about gravamina for a little while.
Sure. I think the one thing before we even talk about that is to note that in all of Christian Reformed Church history, up until this year, only 2 gravamina have ever been filed, and neither of them were ever resolved. One because the person who filed it died before it ever got to Synod. So we're exploring really new ground here in terms of our denomination around what a gravamen is and how they're to be understood, especially in what we anticipate is going to be quite a volume of them in some areas of our denomination. So there's 2 kinds of gravamen, and I think the one that people are most interested in is what we call a confessional difficulty gravamen. Basically, it's you as an office bearer, and it's only office bearers who can file these. So a pastor, a commissioned pastor, an elder, or a deacon would say to their council, I have an issue, I have a difficulty with a confession or an interpretation of the confession, which is what many of us have after Synod 22. You write that up, and I believe Hesed on their website even has kind of like a little go-to, here's how to write a gravamen tutorial that you can access if you wish to. The council receives that gravamen and can do three things with it. It can say, yes, we accept your difficulty. You're still free to serve on our council. We understand that. You're still an officer in good standing. The council could reject your gravamen and say, sorry, you can't be an officer with this difficulty, and could even start disciplinary proceedings against you if they thought it was heresy or something that just really was contrary to scripture or the confessions. And then the third thing it could do, it could say, your council could say, well, we don't really have the theological chops to be able to understand your gravamen, and so we're going to bring it to classes and have classes help us figure out what to do with your gravamen. The important thing to know about gravamen is that they're considered private and pastoral, and so a council is not going to run a bulletin announcement saying we've received a gravamen from such and such a person in our church and we'll be dealing with it at the next council meeting. It's meant to be private. It's meant to be an issue of pastoral care, and church order experts are a little, I've heard two different opinions. One says in the council minutes or the elder minutes, it should at least say so-and-so by name submitted a gravamen that was accepted. Others have said that can go in your executive minutes, but your public minutes of your elders meeting, if you have those two kinds of minutes, would just say we received a gravamen and accepted it. So there's no announcement made to the congregation. There's nothing has to be forwarded to classis. It's strictly a private matter between the office bearer and the council, the elders of that congregation. The other kind of gravamen is a little bit different. That's a confessional revision request, and that's is automatically forwarded from the council to your classis and from classis to synod, and it becomes in fact an overture asking that a confession or an interpretation of a confession be discussed and revised or overturned. There's a whole lot you can say more about that, but the church order has some pretty clear guidelines about how to write those and what those are about. But I think I want to really emphasize again the fact that this is something between the office bearer and their local council, and that's where it stays.
If I could just piggyback on that and make one additional observation, and that is that precisely because of what you just said, Thea, I think all of these attempts that we're hearing about in the denomination to somehow strangle people who have filed a gravamen and not allow them to go to classes or not allow them to go to synod or not allow them to be on the council of delegates are misguided. These are private matters, and when here again we see the importance of a council accepting something. The original authority is with this council. They've accepted your gravamen and said you can serve. It's done. So to people who are watching this and are aware of attempts being made to misuse the gravamen process, I would say this really needs to be resisted.
Yep.
Are my congregation and our council forbidden from discussing any dissent because same-sex sex has been called unchaste and that interpretation given confessional status? Are we free to continue to study these matters?
I would say you're not forbidden, and you are free to discuss such things. There's a way of doing this in churches with any given topic. I think about, teaching a high school catechism class, and we're going to discuss any any topic in there, well, you've got to ask some questions. You've got to expect there's going to be somebody in the room saying, I'm not so sure about X, Y, or Z. And so you've got to talk about it. And that happens at council level as well. It's not an official term, I don't think, in the CRC church order or any such place, but maybe there's such a thing as ecclesiastical freedom, or maybe we could say, how does change actually happen? It happens with somebody disagreeing somewhere and then saying it. There's no real other way to make change. And I guess another way to wonder about this, it seems to me, is that Synod created this. They knew there were thousands of people in the denomination who didn't agree with this. So they created the situation where there are piles of people who don't agree with that particular decision of Synod this past summer. They can't make people agree just by saying that's what we decided. So I'm not trying to be obstinate, but just say that they've created a situation, and so maybe it's okay for little the anxieties on that part of the system, Synod, rather than in our congregations and councils.
I agree with Dave. I think that Synod 2022 itself authorized ongoing discussion. I actually think that we need to be talking about Synod 1 and Synod 2 as far as Synod 2022. I think there were two different synods. Synod 1 is the synod that adopted those opening recommendations of Committee 8. Those recommendations, it's like they're written by a different group. They're full of humility, searching. We need ongoing learning. We need ongoing study. We've only begun to really understand the implications of. Synod 2 is the QA 108 decision and confessional status decision. But I think that we need to, as a church, recognize that there were two different synods here. And we need to spend as much time on Synod 1 and maybe more time on Synod 1. In fact, we have to spend more time on Synod 1 than on Synod 2. And that ongoing discussion it's a mandate of this Synod. Synod calls for it.
Yeah, thanks, Dwayne.
Excellent. Yep, I totally agree.
Can my church council write an overture with an appeal asking a future Synod to rescind the decisions of Synod 22 regarding the HSR?
The answer to that, of course, is yes. And in fact, there are three ways that a council could approach Synod 23 on this issue. The first, of course, is to write an overture, which would be processed through your classes and then submitted to the agenda for Synod for next summer. The second one would be to submit a request for a revision of a decision of a prior Synod. And you can find all of that in Church Order Article 31, if you're looking for the reference there. In that case, it's a request for a revision. It's processed like an overture. It would go through your classes, just like an overture would. The criteria, though, that is important with that is that you have to show that there are sufficient and new grounds for repealing the decision of Synod 22. That would be where the conversation would have to happen. What would be those new grounds? What would be sufficient to say it's time we have to relook at this? And then the third way is what I referred to before, that confessional revision gravamen, which again would be processed eventually like an overture. And that would say, I have a problem with this interpretation of the confession and it needs to be revisited. So there are three different ways you could do that. But all of them, of course, start with a local council and then work through a classis to Synod. And in case you're wondering about time frame, the deadline for that would be March 15, which is when all the items for the agenda for Synod have to be submitted to the synodical office. And someone once asked me in regard to that, is it possible that, especially when you're thinking about the grounds for a revision, is it possible that the general secretary would say, oh, these are insufficient grounds and I'm not going to put this on the agenda? Usually that's not how a general secretary would work. They would instead, if they have to err, they err on the side of inclusion of items in the agenda rather than not putting things in the agenda. So I think there's a good case to be made that a request for a revision could very well be on the agenda, as well as the other two overtures, as well as confessional gravamen. So
I'd like to push you a little bit, Thea, and then ask you too, Dave. Just in terms of what you're hearing, do you think it's safe to say that there will be some confessional difficulty or some confessional revision gravamina at Synod 2023?
I don't know of any right now, but I could see them happening. Yes. How about you, Dave? Have you heard of anyone?
I haven't either. And I wonder if some office bearers are hesitant because one wonders what the outcome will be if your confessional revision gravamen is not accepted. Where does that put that office bearer? It could be a vulnerable place to be. So I can imagine that'd be one reason. I know of some overtures that are, I think some people are working on some overtures to address the decision.
Must delegates to future synods subscribe to the confessional position of the church regarding unchastity? Right.
I would come at that a little differently. I would want to ask that question differently. I would want to say that office bearers ought to be office bearers in good standing. And that means office bearers who've signed the covenant for office bearers at the appropriate assembly. And then behind that can be these gravamen that we've been talking about. And so, but that gets dealt with personally, privately, and at council level. And after that, an office bearer should be sent on in good standing and understood to be so. There's no reason that a classis or a synod should be saying, hey, but each person needs to say yes to this particular point in the confessions. We've never done that with any other point in the confessions. And again, it would have been interesting in history if we had, and people had answered honestly where that would have put everybody. But that's just where it starts, is with council again, with that original authority.
May a congregation conscientiously object to synod's decisions and declare themselves a welcoming and affirming church?
Let me start the response to that question. And again, I want to make it clear, I'm only speaking out of our own personal experience at Eastern Avenue. Eastern Avenue has made such a statement publicly, and they've informed classis Grand Rapids East of that policy that they've made. We are one of 4 congregations in our classis that have made public statements like that. And in our classis, so far, no other congregation has raised an issue or at least formally raised an issue with those positions taken by these 4 congregations. So for us, it's been a good thing, a wonderful thing to have embraced that position and to let the broader community and church know where we stand. But we haven't felt like we've also felt like we've been in a safe classis where we can make that statement and not feel like we're going to be rebuked or have our council deposed or any of those kinds of actions taken against it. I think you can take that stand, but again, you have to be really aware of how your classes will react to that and what the response would be. I know that we have Henry DeMoore as part of our classis, and he has also suggested that as a congregation, if a congregation makes that kind of affirmative stand, they really are not compelled by church order to make that public to classis. They can keep it a private statement if they so wish. They're not obligated to inform classis of that decision. Does that mean you shouldn't? Well, I think it's much more honest and open and loving to let the rest of your classes know where you stand on that. But he would say that church order is very clear that you are not obligated to share that with your classes if you don't wish to. But Dave, you've got some thoughts about that too, I think, right?
I don't know how much I have thoughts about it, but I think you're right that a lot will depend on one's congregational context and then classis context. I think it probably would fall somewhere in the realm of conscientious objection. I'm not sure otherwise how it fits with sort of agreements and church order rules in our denomination to make such, for a church or a council to make such a statement. I might point again, maybe I'm becoming a broken record, out of the fact that Synod's created this odd situation we're in, where again, it already knew what a lot of people thought and what a lot of people felt that their ministry, what they were called to do by God for the sake of other people, for the sake of queer people in our communities. That's a serious thing to wrestle with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's not a decision I would make lightly at all. It requires a lot of conversation at the congregational level. Dwayne, you've experienced that at Neyland. I know you did not rush to a decision at all about taking the stance Neyland took. So,
yeah.
No, and when Neyland made its decision, it was deciding something very much in the context of Synod's pronouncements on homosexuality being pastoral advice.
mm-hmm.
Now, of course, we're no longer in that context. We've given confessional status to this. So it makes it all the more weighty, but it doesn't, what doesn't change is that congregations have their own conscience about these things. And as Dave says, Synod made this decision fully aware of the different conscience that people have about these matters. And I think a lot of people don't realize that that a very important Reformed principle is we as the church do not bind the conscience where Scripture does not bind the conscience. And when it's not clear that Scripture is binding the conscience, Reformed people want to stay away from that. It goes back to our Catholic, the dealing with the Catholic Church, and it was a feeling that the Roman Catholic Church was just binding the conscience of local churches all over the place without scriptural warrant and where there wasn't scriptural clarity. And Reformed people really want to stay away from that. And it is a grave, important matter. I don't think that it is a matter of breaking covenant, which is an epitaph that has been used against Neyland a lot.
Mm-hmm.
I think even in this context, I would argue that the churches of Classis Grand Rapids East have a deep covenantal connection to the Christian Reformed Church, very deep. And that covenantal connection is not changed because it has made some radical decisions, even in the context of this now having confessional status. This is where a lot of ink will be spilled in the coming years. Could I get kicked out of the church because of my dissent? If I'm a minister, could I lose my job? There's a lot of fear out there. How do we help people who are maybe struggling for their very livelihood and wondering about that?
Yeah, that is a good question, Dwayne. Could one get kicked out of the CRC, an office bearer minister especially? Maybe, maybe not. It depends a little bit what you're thinking about when we ask the question. I think on the one hand, dissent shouldn't automatically mean getting kicked out. I don't think that's what denominations are called to do, is to try to find the people who are dissenters and kick them out. There's room for conversations. There's such a thing as gravamina. We've talked about them. There can be such a thing as trust, such a thing as wrestling. But having said all that, councils can do that, kick office bearers out, kick ministers out even. But lots of times no, I shouldn't say lots of times. Those reasons aren't always appropriate. So what are we following in those moments? What are our principles? What do we want as we serve Jesus Christ and serve his people? It should also be said that ministers, and there are lots of them, who serve in a sense, two bodies are called by a church but serving not in parish ministry will have some kind of other supervisory board. And those ministers are going to want to have conversations with those boards about what's going on in the CRC and their own positions and so on. Or at least I hope they're in a position where they can have a good, healthy conversation about those things. Maybe the two of you have other thoughts about this question.
I would just add that since I'm retired, in some ways it's kind of a relief that I don't have to think about leaving the denomination. But I really am so concerned about those who are in the middle of their career and their ministry in the CRC and are really, really struggling with whether or not they should stay or leave. I think that's just going to be that's such a important question and a difficult one. And I think we need to pray for discernment and trust and honesty and support for those pastors as they struggle with that issue. I fear that we'll lose some of our best leadership in our denomination over this issue because they can't honestly be a part of a denomination that has taken the stand it's taken. Yeah.
Yeah, I think obviously it depends on the location of a particular minister, what classes they're in. And I think that some pastors will be much more vulnerable than others. I think the pastors need to, I respect pastors who decide, I'm not going to fight this. I can't stay in this denomination because of its position. I would also encourage pastors to fight the good fight here because, people have said to Neelan, why don't you just leave? Why don't you just leave the Christian Reformed Church? And our answer is twofold. Number one, we love the Christian Reformed Church and we are Christian Reformed. And number two, in every Christian Reformed congregation, there are LGBTQ children of God, and we don't want to abandon them. And we think that we are needed. Our voice is needed. And so I hope that we can encourage one another to good works and to persevering in the fight. And yes, as Thea said, I'm retired too. And in the sense, it's very easy for me to talk this way. But we need to encourage one another as much as we can. Any concluding word as we come right up to 30 minutes here?
Not for me.
Not for me. Thanks, though. Good questions.
If not, thank you very much. And to those who are listening to this, God's peace and grace be with you in these difficult times. God bless you all.